Hello and welcome to today's episode of pianoTV. So today I wanted to take a closer look at the composition called Symphonie Fantastique by Berlioz. And it's really spooky and scary and hair-raising, so I thought it would be a perfect one to talk about on Halloween, because that's today. We are going to particularly be taking a look at the fifth and final movement of this symphony today, which is called the Witch's Sabbath, so it's extra Halloween appropriate. Let's get started. The full title for Symphonie Fantastique is The Fantastical Symphony, an episode in the life of an artist in 5 parts. This symphony was written by the French composer Hector Berlioz in the early Romantic era in 1830. So Berlioz would have been about 27 years old when this was written, and it's also the composition that he's most well known for. This symphony is one of music's first drug trips. Not only does it have opium in the story, but people think that Berlioz himself was at least partially under the influence of opium when he wrote some of this symphony. The other thing about this symphony is that it's huge. It calls for 90 people performing in the symphony, which is bigger than anything had been up until that point. So this symphony was first composed in 1830, but Berlioz heavily rewrote it and reworked it so that over the next 15 years, by 1845, it was basically a completely different symphony, and that's the version that we all know today. This was also Berlioz's breakthrough work. This is what got him into the public arena, and you can really hear almost like a passing of the torch from Beethoven's symphonies to Berlioz, except Berlioz goes deeper and darker and explores more uncharted territories than Beethoven ever did. The influence of opera is also clearly felt in this symphony, what with the wild and epic storylines and Berlioz's own background with opera. We won't get too much into Berlioz today. That's the subject of another video. Just something to listen for. So this symphony falls under the category of program music, and program music is a genre where there's usually literally a program accompanying the music, so like some type of text to explain what kind of story the music is telling. So the particular story of this symphony is all about an artist who is really tragic because he's in love with someone who doesn't love him back, and he's doing a whole bunch of opium because of it. For each of the movements and for the preface, Berlioz wrote the program notes himself, and this is what he wrote in the 1845 publication. The composer's intention has been to develop various episodes in the life of an artist, insofar as they lend themselves to musical treatment. As the work cannot rely on the assistance of speech, the plan of the instrumental drama needs to be set out in advance. The following program must therefore be considered as the spoken text of an opera, which serves to introduce musical movements and to motivate their character and expression. At the time this was composed, symphonies generally had 3 or 4 movements. Symphonie Fantastique had 5 movements, and they are as follows. We have the Reveries and Passions. This is the first movement, a ball, second movement, Scene in the Fields, March to the Scaffold, and then Dream of the Night of the Sabbath. Now, I didn't want to skim over these movements too briefly, so today what I decided to do is focus exclusively on the last movement, the Dream of the Night of the Sabbath, or as it's sometimes shortened to, the Witch's Sabbath, because I wanted to talk about something spooky and Halloween-y today, since it's Halloween today. Before we get into this, let's take a look at what Berlioz had to say about this movement in the program notes. Alright, so he sees himself at a Witch's Sabbath, in the midst of a hideous gathering of shades, sorcerers, and monsters of every kind who have come together for his funeral. Strange sounds, groans, outbursts of laughter, distant shouts which seem to be answered by more shouts. The beloved melody appears once more, but has now lost its noble and shy character. It is now no more than a vulgar dance tune, trivial and grotesque. It is she who is coming to the Sabbath, roar of delight at her arrival. She joins the diabolical orgy. The funeral knell tolls, burlesque parody of the Dies Irae, the dance of the witches. The dance of the witches combined with the Dies Irae. Just to give a little explanation on what the Dies Irae is, it's a very old medieval Latin hymn that means Day of Wrath. It's used and quoted over and over again in classical and contemporary music and literature. It's really intense and deals with the Last Judgment. So this symphony was really bold and forward for its time, not only for having 5 movements, but it's also much more intense and frightening than anything else that had come before it. We'll start by dividing this piece into 4 different parts. So we're going to look at the introduction, the Allegro section, the Dies Irae, and then the Witch's Round Dance. So the introduction of the 5th movement starts off on a really slow, creepy, dramatic note. There are special effects by the string instruments like pizzicato and tremolo, which adds to this kind of like creepy atmosphere. And Berlioz uses really big, sudden dynamic changes like sforzandos and fortissimos to kind of like, I don't know, psych us out. It's like he lulls us along with this like quiet music, and then all of a sudden, blam! So let's take a listen to it so you can hear what I'm talking about. On measure 21, we hit a tempo change to Allegro, and that's our second part. This is where we hear the fixed idea, which is basically just a recurring melody that links the whole symphony together. So if you listen to the entire symphony, you'll hear it in the other movements as well. And this is the one that Berlioz was referring to as getting all twisted up. So we start with the fixed idea, played by the C clarinet right here. But later on, it gets all gnarly and twisted up, and you'll be able to hear that when we take a listen. The first thing that happens is it gets blasted into loud chaos on bar 29 during the Allegro Assai section. Then we continue along, and that fixed idea repeats again, this time with an E flat clarinet, which gives us a higher pitched, more shrill sound than the original C clarinet. So let's take a quick listen to this main theme or fixed idea of the symphony. So leading into the Dies Irae section, Berlioz uses some ominous-sounding tubular bells to lead us into it, which will officially start on bar 127. So here's our official Dies Irae section starting at bar 127, which is announced by 4 bassoons and 2 tubas, which has a really neat dark effect when they're played in conjunction with each other. So let's take a listen to this entrance, and then we will go deeper into the woods. Once we start getting a little more rhythm and movements in the Dies Irae section, we start really getting into like the bulk of the piece, and that's where the string instruments kick in. And I think this is probably one of the coolest parts of the entire symphony. The Dies Irae theme in this movement is all about like impending death. That's the takeaway. So sometimes we feel like this death presence is just kind of like hanging out in the corner, but sometimes it's like front and center, full force, can't escape it. And you'll hear the Dies Irae section repeated later in the composition, and you'll hear that it's much more dramatic the second time around. Once we reach bar 222, we get into the Witch's Round Dance motif, which is repeatedly played by the strings like you can see on the screen. And this part is punctuated by repeated brass notes. So once we get through this introductory segment, we hear the full motif, the full Sabbath round, played at bar 241. And this part is feverish and jubilant and manic and exhilarating all at once. This is also a really long section of the symphony. It goes through many epic phases, which I'm not going to have time to show you here, but definitely check out the full version. Then on bar 414, we hear the return of the Dies Irae tune, which is this time blaring loudly as brass instruments. This is another really great moment in the composition. The ecstasy of the witch's Sabbath starts turning into something more ominous. It's a darkness, and death really starts gripping the whole mania of it. This is the big grand finale of the entire symphony. Death is triumphant. If this part doesn't make your heart pound, I don't think that anything in life will. And that is all for today's closer look at Berlioz's Symphonie Fantastique. I wish you all a happy Halloween. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please give it a thumbs up if you did. I always really appreciate that. You can come hang out on social media, and if you haven't already, you can check out our Patreon page as well if you'd like to show your support that way. Thanks. Catch you in the next video. So this symphony... Oh, my hair's getting in my face.